Dear viewers around the world, a warm welcome to you all from Oslo and the Viking Ship Museum. My name is Håkon Glørstad and I am the director of this museum, which is the custodian of the most prominent archaeological objects found from the Viking era, the three Viking ships from Gokstad, Oseberg and Tune. Over the next 4 weeks, we dedicate Museum Mondays on Viking.TV to our Viking collection and to the new knowledge about the Vikings produced by our researchers. And we will take you a closer look at the ships in the museum, of course, but also visit our state-of-the-art storage facilities where we keep other objects from the Viking Age. For the first time in more than 100 years, we have the opportunity to visit an archaeological excavation of a burial site containing the remnants of a Viking ship. And this will be a special treat that will sum up the 4 episodes in September. The Viking Ship Museum is part of the Museum of Cultural History and the University of Oslo. Being part of a research-intensive university, it is perhaps a paradox that the Museum of Cultural History is also one of the most popular museums in Norway, with high visitor numbers throughout the year. This summer, we missed a large number of international guests who normally visit the museum. We are therefore very glad that Viking, in these challenging times, provides us with the opportunity to reach out to a dedicated audience of travelers and history fans around the world. In previous years, we have already cooperated with Viking on other rewarding outreach projects. We are therefore happy to continue the collaboration through the Museum Monday show. If you, during the emission, should spot some cables or tools on the floor, this has a most fortunate explanation. We are busy preparing for an extension of today's museum building. In a few years' time, we will be able to welcome you all to a brand new Viking Age museum with impressive new exhibitions, better conservation conditions for the ships, and intensified research on the Viking Age. Now I will give the word to our host, archaeologist and museum lecturer Ellen Marie Næss, and to our guest this week, Professor Jan Bill, archaeologist and curator of the Viking ships. I hope you will enjoy the next Museum Mondays in our company, so a warm welcome to all of you.
Welcome to this episode of Viking.TV. I'm Ellen Marie Næss, archaeologist and lecturer at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. With me today, I have Professor Jan Bill, the curator of the Viking ship collection. And he will tell us more about the most important symbol of the Viking Age, the Viking ships. And Jan, behind us, we have one of the most famous Viking ships in the world. What's really the big deal of the Viking ships? And why are they still preserved after more than 1,000 years in the earth?
Well, the real deal about the Viking ships, that is that they made the Viking Age possible. Without the Viking ships, there would not have been a Viking Age. It was the ships which were the vehicles on which they could travel out from Scandinavia, out in Europe, into Asia, plunder, establish colonies, travel to unsettled lands in the North Atlantic, and basically spread over a large part of the Northern Hemisphere. So the Viking ships were crucial as the means for making the Viking Age happen. Now, behind me we have the most well-preserved Viking ship that exists today. It's the Oseberg ship, and it was preserved because of the very, very special circumstances under which it ended up in the ground. Because it did not sink out on the sea, what happened was actually that this ship was put into the ground as the burial ship for a very important, or perhaps 2 important, women in the year 834. And this burial took place in a valley filled with clay. So the clay, which came to encapsulate the ship, actually preserved it until this very day. So here behind me we have an almost 1200-year-old ship, just like it looked back then in the Viking Age. What we see is that the ship is fantastically decorated, and not all Viking ships were decorated like this, but many were. These decorations tells us more about the ship than just its construction, because it tells us that this was a very, very important object for the Vikings. It was not just a means of transport, it encapsulated much of the ideas that they had about the world, life in the world, the life after death, and how the entire cosmos was constructed. Now, if we're looking up into the very top of the stem of the ship, what we see up there is the head of a snake and a serpent-like body, which actually goes down, transforms into the very body of the ship. So the entire ship takes the shape of a giant snake which is moving across the ocean. And this idea is something that we find also in the mythology about the ships and their role in those times.
Somehow, I think this might remind me of the myth of Beowulf. Are there any connection there?
Oh yes, I think there is a connection to Beowulf. Beowulf is a poem written down the first time probably in the 8th century in Anglo-Saxon England, but with roots which are much older, going back to Scandinavia from the centuries before. And in that poem there is a very important part for the understanding of these ship burials. What we read in Beowulf is that in the old times a small baby washed up in a boat on the shores of the kingdom of Denmark. This child was lying on a shield surrounded by wonderful weapons. Of course, the child and the weapons and everything was brought to the king in Denmark, and he adopted the child, and it grew up by him and became the next king of Denmark. And in that way, a new dynasty was established, because this boy, of course, represented a new bloodline. Now, the interesting thing is that there is also a description of what happens when this King Shield, King Skjold, as he is called, when he gets older and recognizes that death is coming to him, because he orders his followers to put him on a ship when he's dead, surround him with weapons and grave gifts which are not to be less beautiful, less fantastic than those which were with him as he came. And then they are going to push out the ship into the sea. And that is what they do in the poem. And the ship sails away, driven by the currents, and disappears. And nobody knows where this ship is taking its cargo. From later writers we know that this ship was, this boat was in the beginning sent from the god Odin, the mightiest of the gods in the Norse universe, with his son, so that it was really a son of Odin who became the king of the Danes. And this fits into a pattern that we know from all over the Germanic area, where we see that royal families, they establish foundation myth which makes them the rightful heirs of kingdoms, because they are ultimately the descendants of gods. We think that what we're looking at when we're looking at these beautiful ship graves that we have here in Norway, we are looking at the material expression of that myth, that in the burial of kings and queens, you use this myth to solidify your rule. So you are basically reenacting the burial of King Skjold, but you're doing it not by pushing the ship out on the sea, but by putting it into the ground and build a huge mound over it so that it will stand as a landmark and as a memorial over this particular person and over the origins of that family.
Nevertheless, this ship was a ship made for use in the real world. Do you think this ship could really have sailed to, let's say, Iceland?
Well, this ship here behind me is not really the kind of ship that you would use to travel across the open oceans. It is perhaps more a ship that was meant to be used in the waters between Denmark and Norway, along the Norwegian coast, into the Baltic. We also have to remember that at this time, you definitely were making journeys for plunder or for other purposes out into the North Sea and further away to Ireland, but Iceland was not yet on the map for the Scandinavians. But I can show you another ship, which definitely was one that you could use to travel to Iceland with. And with that you could even have traveled to North America, you could travel down into the Mediterranean, you could have traveled all over the globe basically, although the Vikings didn't really do that. So this is one of the ships that could be used for traveling the oceans. This is the Gokstad ship, which was built about 80 years later than the Oseberg ship that we were just looking at. And in the meantime, a lot of developments had taken place in Scandinavian shipbuilding. So this ship is much better suited for crossing open waters. Probably that came along with a change also in the way that Vikings navigated, not relying so much on traveling along the coast and going more out on the open sea, crossing directly from Scandinavia to England, Scotland, crossing directly further on to Iceland and ultimately to Greenland and North America. Other ships, probably also like this, took completely different directions and traveled down to the Mediterranean. Vikings even sailed on ships in the Caspian Sea, although we do not know if they actually brought ships there or if they built ships, just brought the knowledge of shipbuilding to the coast of the Caspian Sea.
This ship is so impressive. It must have been an amazing sight at sea. But did the Vikings prefer to sail just with one ship, or did they prefer to gather them into a fleet?
Well, I think that amazing might be a word which fits well if you're seeing a Viking fleet coming back home. But if you are seeing a Viking fleet and yourself is an Anglo-Saxon, it's probably not amazing. It's probably more frightening, because the Vikings were not really traveling just one ship alone, perhaps unless it was a cargo vessel and traders on board. No, the Vikings preferred to travel in fleets. In the early Viking Age, these fleets were probably quite small, but later on they could consist of hundreds of ships. So maybe you should imagine 100, 200, 300 vessels like this approaching your beach, and then you would probably be very, very scared, and with good reason. Now the ships here, the ships of the Vikings, were basically amphibious warships. They were extremely well suited for navigating coasts and rivers, because they did not have a deep draft and they had lots of oars. They were not very heavy, so it was easy to move them even over land if you needed to. Now that the Viking ships had these qualities is probably a result of their history. Viking ships are descendants of a long boat building tradition which had been established in Scandinavia in centuries before the Viking Age. Now, Scandinavia is an area where you cannot live without sailing. You have long coastlines. The areas where you can actually settle and live mostly lies along these coastlines, and the interior is filled with mountains and forests which are hard to travel through. So there's long tradition already in the Viking Age that if you traveled, you had to use boats. But on the other hand, Scandinavia was also outside the mainstream of European economic and technological development. So they didn't take in much of what happened in Europe in terms of developing sail until very, very late. Actually, not until the centuries directly before the Viking Age. So in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, what you had was a long tradition of building very, very light rowing boats. And then at some point in the 7th or 8th century, you started to put sail on these boats. And they were very light and became extremely efficient, quick. They became the Viking ship. If you look out in Europe at the same time, we have few finds from there. But what we do know is that you had for centuries been building sailing ships for cargo transport, because it was the cargo which was important to travel on the waterways. Person transport you could take over land. So it was two completely different traditions or two completely different reasons for building ships, and the ships became very different. So perhaps that was what basically made the Viking ships superior to ships being built in other parts of Europe. They were specialized ships for quick communication, basically also for warfare.
So what you are saying is that this ship could actually have been a warship?
Oh yes, indeed. This is a warship.
So if this ship and all the Viking ship has been used as sailing ship and as a warship, who actually buried them in them afterwards?
Well, we can go and meet one of them. The man who was buried in this ship is lying down here, or the remains of him at least. And since these graves are not illustrated through written sources, but only from the archaeology, of course we do not know the name of anyone who was buried there, and we can't even really be sure of what kind of social role they had. But we do believe that they were the kings and queens of that time. And here we have the very few remains of the Gokstad man. He was perhaps around 50 years old when he died. He was a very big man compared to how people looked in the Viking Age. And he was very strongly built, big muscles. We can see that he must have had good nutrition as he grew up. He must have been training a lot. He even had what we today would call a tennis elbow, but which was perhaps in the Viking Age a sword elbow instead.
The Viking Age is so interesting. What are you working with right now, Jan?
Well, I'm trying to figure out why do we have these ship burials, and I'm trying to figure out what is the relationship between that man and that ship, because obviously he was buried in it, but what is really the story to tell. But we are a large group of Viking researchers here at the museum, and other people are working with other things. And one of our most exciting projects right now is that we are actually excavating a new big ship grave that was found only 2 years ago, and which we are now trying to excavate in a way so that we can understand both the ship technology in this new ship, but also the rituals of that particular burial. It will be the first time for 100 years that we excavate a ship burial here in Norway, and that is going to be amazing.
Thank you so much, Jan. And we will actually visit the Gjellestad excavation in one of the next episodes on Viking.TV. You should prepare your questions and write them down, and while you are thinking and preparing and sending in your questions, we will show you the short film that we have made in cooperation with Viking on Viking ships and building technique of the ships. See you in 5 minutes.
3 millimeter opp, tenker jeg. 40 millimeter opp.
Fint. Veldig fint.
Ja, men det skal vel litt dypere ned der, tenker
Jeg
jeg.
tenker at akkurat den kurven som du har her,
Ja,
det er helt frem.
det gjør det.
Hi everybody, and welcome to this question answer session. I'm glad that you hang on with us, and I hope that I can answer some of your questions. And we have a lot of them already, so we'll just start from an end. John from Odenton has asked if the longboat was the only type of vessel used by the Norsemen, and if not, which other types of boats were being used. Well, they did use other boats than just the longboats, because longboats were the specialized war canoes, war boats. But they, of course, built also vessels for fisheries, or especially towards the end of the Viking Age for cargo transport. So the largest cargo ship which has been found in Scandinavia from the Viking Age was capable of transporting some 60 metric tons of cargo. So that was a really huge vessel which would have come in handy if you wanted, for example, to sail to Greenland or to Iceland. Now, if we move on to Jen Johnson from San Antonio, we have a question whether it's likely to find more large, well-preserved Viking ships. And I think it is, if we are lucky, because there might be some out there on the seafloor or in the seafloor, which are still very well preserved and have not been noticed. However, it's very, very rare that we do find Viking ships that have actually sunk. Mostly we find them either in graves, so they have been buried, or we find them on the beach, where they have sunk directly on the beach or stranded and then been covered by sediments, or we find them deliberately sunk outside a harbor or somewhere else in order to actually block the access for other ships into that particular location. The reason is, of course, that Viking ships have been built of wood, and that doesn't sink easily. So mostly a shipwrecked vessel will just wash up on the shore.
Now, Diane from Beaumont, Texas is telling us that she had a very nice visit here in 2016. Thank you for that message. We hope that you and many others will come back and visit us again. We are in the process of constructing a new museum for the Viking ships. And that means that our museum will be closed for several years. So it might be a good idea not to wait too long or to come back in 26 or something like that to see the ships in the new museum. Now we have a question here from Herbert and Laurel. Were most Viking longships similar in size, and are there any larger ones than those that we have seen at the museum? Yes, there are, because Viking ships were built in many different sizes. The largest that we know of is about 27 meters long, and oh, sorry, I'm wrong about that. The largest one that we have is considerably longer, 37 meters, and could transport maybe 100 people. That was a longship which was built in 1042 in Ireland, in the Viking town of Dublin, and then it was finally scuttled on the beach in Roskilde, which was then the capital of the Kingdom of Denmark. Now, if we are moving on to Linda from Roanoke, we have a question here. What kind of wood were the Viking ships built from? That depends on what was available, but if oak was there, they would have preferred to use that, because that was the most durable and strongest wood that you could find in the Scandinavian forests. But it didn't grow very far north. So if you came as high north as Trondheim, or perhaps even south of that, then actually you would build your Viking ships of pine, which is also a splendid material for shipbuilding. There is a question whether we have been doing any DNA testing on the bodies that were being found in the Oseberg and Gokstad ships. Some testing was done several years ago and was not able to produce reliable results. For the time being, we are putting a hold on making new DNA tests simply because we do not want to consume that little material which we have, which is suitable for DNA tests. But in the future, if one day the methods allows it and we can make DNA tests with only very, very, very minimal damage to the bones that we have left, then of course it's possible that we will be trying that again. Now, Diane from Beaumont asks how intact the ships that you have been seeing were when they were being excavated. And the answer is that the Oseberg ship was almost completely intact. The only portions missing there was a part of the stern post, which had rotted away, and a few other details like the upper part of the mast, obviously. It's actually quite a wonder that so much of the stem post is preserved, because that was, of course, also very high up in the burial mound that covered the ships. But because the burial had been robbed back in the 10th century, and the people robbing the burial had actually been cutting down the stem post, it ended up so deep down in the mound that it actually was preserved, and we still have it at the museum today. There's a question here where the Vikings stored their provisions and where did they sleep on long journeys. Both the Oseberg and Gokstad ships are made in a way so that each person would have to bring his or her own chest to sit on when rowing, and that chest would probably also carry the provisions for that particular individual. But then, of course, you needed to have much more with you, and we have to imagine that a ship on a voyage would not look as nice and clean as the ship does in the Viking Museum today. They would be rather stacked with all the things that you needed for the voyage: drinking water, you needed bags made of hide so that you could sleep warm, and so on and so forth. Weapons, of course, need to be there. There is storage place in the Viking ships below the deck, but it's not really a dry storage because the decks are not watertight. So everything that you put down there will have to be very carefully packed and stowed away. There's also a question here from Gary in Ellicott City. How many people were on board these ships? Well, that depends on the kind of voyage that you were making. If you just took a ship full of warriors to take it to the next fjord in order to do some harm there, then you might well have put 100 people into the Gokstad ship because it was just such a short voyage. But if you wanted to cross the North Sea or go even further, then you would probably not be more than 35 to 40 people on board in a ship like that. And if you had to go really long, like sailing to Iceland or Greenland, then you would take really bulky vessels and you would have a rather small crew, because you wouldn't do that with oars. You would sail all the way, so you didn't need to have any big crew. Then there's a question here which we hear very, very often from a very observant person here, Donald from Bradenton, asking, why do the oarlocks have a notch? So the oarlocks, that's the holes where the oars are put through in the upper part of the side of the ship. And the reason for this notch is simply that allows the oar blade to slide through as well. If you didn't have the notch, then you would have to put in the oars from the outside of the vessel, and that would, of course, be very impractical. Now, if we move on to Joyce from Des Moines, she asks, what process does conservators use to preserve and protect these very old ships? Well, the fantastic thing about these ships is that they do not really need a lot of conservation. They were so well preserved when they were excavated that it was sufficient just to treat them with a creosote in order to prevent fungi to attack them, and then they were allowed to dry very slowly, and that worked out well. That's rather unusual, however. Ships which have been found not in clay but in other types, other conditions, for example, in the seafloor, they would often be so heavily degraded that you needed to replace the water inside them with another material as you dried them up. Otherwise, they would simply collapse. And the material that you usually use for that is called polyethylene glycol, which is an artificial wax, and you put that into the tree in a watery solution, and then you freeze dry the wood, and the PEG, as we call it, will then stabilize the cells and prevent them from collapsing as the water is disappearing. Now, Alison from East Haddam asks how many ship burials we have actually found. And if you're looking all over Europe, it will be around 15, depending on how you count them. The easternmost ship grave is from Estonia, and the westernmost is actually from the eastern parts of Great Britain. Most of them are found in Norway, and that's also the only place where we have really well preserved ships from these burials. Now, if we look at Joan's question here, she's asking, what sources do you use to learn more about the persons buried in the ships? We'll use a lot of different sources for that. Of course, the most important is the remains of the skeletons, if there are any. That can help us to say something about biological sex and so on. Then, of course, the finds around the persons, or the objects which were given with the person into the grave, tells us a lot about the ideas about the social role of that person. And then, of course, we also go to the literature and see what role persons buried in ships used to have in the Viking Age. And of course, none of the ship burials that we know of can actually be attributed to a historical known person, but we can see that ship burials in that size that we see, that was probably something which was intimately connected to rulership, to kings and queens. David from Colorado asks, what were the improvements which allowed the Viking ships to progress from sailing along the coast to navigating open seas to Iceland and beyond? Well, the most crucial thing was probably that the sailing technique, which came quite late to Scandinavia, was developed into a very safe source of propulsion. That means that the Vikings had learned to build hulls which were very stable, which did not capsize easily, and they had learned to produce sailcloth and ropes and rigging, which was durable and which you could count upon also when the weather was bad. We cannot point to any specific navigation tools or similar things which made it possible to navigate on open waters, but what we do know is that the Scandinavians were very aware of looking at the signs in nature, that is birds which would need to sleep on land, so in the afternoon they would always fly in the direction of the nearest coast. It could be whales which traditionally would seek their food not too far from the coast, because that's where their food would come up from the deep, the depth of the ocean. They would also, of course, look for the stars and the direction of the waves and so on. So they basically navigated on the basis of what they could observe during the journey, and then of course they heavily relied on bringing in knowledge that somebody else had gathered before. For example, Irish monks were traveling to Iceland before the Scandinavians started to go there, so certainly they have made sure that they learned whatever was possible to learn about that. There is a question here which I think is very interesting. Stephanie from Pasadena writes, just curious why we attached nobility to these bodies. Could they be prisoners from lands visited or society's outcasts? Well, actually we have two women in the Oseberg burial, and we do not know which social roles they had. One of them might have been a slave. We cannot say, but it could also well be that she was actually a very high-ranking woman, which was buried together with someone even more high-ranking. The reason that we believe that they are high-ranking, that's simply because of the amount of wealth which are being invested in these burials. Not only is the ship there and all the grave goods which are put into the burial, but also a lot of animals, 15 horses, for example, in the Oseberg burial, and also the sheer amount of work going into the burial. After putting the deceased into the ship and finishing the burial rituals, a huge mound was being built over these ship burials, a mound of some 40 to 50 meters in diameter and maybe 6-7 meters high. So basically you took all the soil, stripped the soil off from a very big area and used it to put in the mound. So the idea is that you do not do that if you are not trying to make a monument over somebody very important in society. Joan from Glenview is asking also, how do you know that the ships were being built without drawings? Well, for several reasons. One is that the means for making drawings were not around in the Viking Age, like paper or drawing tools, but also, and that's more important, of course, is that we know that traditional boat building in Scandinavia, and especially in Norway, worked without drawings up to modern times, even up into the 20th century. And what the boat builders did when they were building boats, which were very much built the same way as the Viking ships, was that they had a number of rules of thumb, and they had a number of very simple measuring tools, like lines with knots on or sticks of different length. And then they actually used these tools in a certain order, and that was enough to reproduce the same dimensions every time they built a new boat. Then Bill from Bloomington is asking, why did the Vikings sometimes set their ships on fire and send them out to the sea? Well, we don't know if they did. The only archaeological example that we know of that is from the harbor of Hedeby at the border between Denmark and Germany, a big Viking Age trading town, where a very well-built, beautiful longship had been filled with scrap wood and set at fire and then sent drifting in towards the harbor fortifications, apparently with the goal of burning down the harbor. We read similar descriptions in some written sources, and that was, of course, a way to try to destroy fortifications. But I think maybe Bill is more wondering about burials in the shape of ship burials in a burning ship on the sea. And we do not have any archaeological evidence for that. What we know is that it was part of the mythology, that the Scandinavians had a myth about the burial of the god Balder, and in this myth it is described that he was sent out on sea in his own ship when it was burning, and that was his funeral. We also have a couple of descriptions from high medieval authors, Saxo Grammaticus, who describes how Viking Age kings choose to have that kind of funeral. But obviously this is very theoretical, and if it really happened or not, we do not know simply. Susan is asking basically whether the Viking Age civilization had a religion, and if I could describe it. Well, that would be a really big task, but the Vikings, they believed that there was, of course, a cosmos, and they had multiple gods. The biggest of them was Odin, and the gods resided in one of altogether 9 worlds which existed. The humans, we lived in another world, and actually if you were a heroic warrior and you died fighting, then you would, after your death, go to this realm of gods and spend your afterlife there. Let's go down here to see if we have more questions that I actually can answer. There's a question here from Philip, and he's asking how many researchers are working on Viking-related research, and is there much research going on in the US? I think that if you look worldwide, then there are quite a lot of researchers working on Viking Age. Maybe 500, maybe more. Not so many of them are in the States, but there is the Institute of Scandinavian Studies in Kalamazoo, which are doing a lot of good work. There are also Viking scholars both in Australia and South America and so on. So it's a topic which interests people from many different parts of the world. Marta from Endicott asks, did only the men go on the voyage on the ship? No. Actually, we know that that many women followed suit. Entire families were going. And we can see that, for example, when we are looking at the records and the skeletal materials left in some of the graves in Great Britain containing Scandinavian Vikings, because what we see is that the big army which was conquering parts of Great Britain in the late 9th century. That army also consisted of a lot of women and families, something which is not so unusual at that time, that basically entire families were traveling with the army. So they must have been on the ships as well. Now, if we move on, Barbara asks along the same line, were women involved in either the construction and or the crewing of the ships? Well, that we really do not know. What we do know is that, as it was said in the video as well, the sails were very important and very costly parts of the ships, and most of the textile production tools that we have found from the Viking Age are from female burials, so that is at least one place where they played a very important role. Now Gail Kerr from Lancaster asks why they buried the ships at all. Well, for 2 reasons. One is that it was a mean of transport, so that Dad could use that for his or her travel further on to the realm of death. But the other one is actually that that possibly the very powerful people tried to mimic the burial of Balder that I mentioned before, thereby claiming that they actually had a connection to the gods and ultimately to Odin, who was Balder's father. I've been around where Viking ships have been discovered. That is in Norway, it is in northern Germany, in Denmark, and then Sutton Hoo, that is actually Anglo-Saxon ships, and they are from the years around 600, so they are slightly earlier than the Viking Age. And then we have Estonia, as mentioned before. Faith is asking about the wood and how it was made waterproof. Well, one of the things that we find from the Viking Age, that is tier production facilities out in the forest. So they were making tar from wood, from pine wood, and using that for making the ships watertight. And I think that we are about to go in for landing here, although there are a lot of good questions here, which I would love to try to answer, but time is running out a little bit on us. There's a question here which goes on with the waterproofing question. What materials were used as caulking in the ships? And what we see is that usually you use wool for it. And the fascinating thing is that you did not use very much, just a very thin string that you had made. That's very much in contrast to how you build ships later on in the Middle Ages. But the Viking aesthetics around shipbuildings required that you made very, very nice craftsmanship, and therefore you did not need a lot of caulking material in order to make the ships watertight, because the wood was very, very well fit together in the first place. Well, thank you very much for joining us in this question and answers session. Next Monday, our collection manager, Anne-Louise Onnestad, she invites us to the museum's storage facilities outside of Oslo's city centre, and we'll visit the state-of-the-art storage rooms and laboratories and learn about different challenges and techniques in keeping the archaeological objects safe for future research and display. So you can look forward to that. Stay safe. Thank you very much.